I'm good, Phil. How are you doing?
you know, Certainly in a good position spiritually, certainly in a good position as we kind of sit down to the text of James. Hopefully, we'll be able to spend a good bit of time going through at least verses 19 through the end of chapter 1 and maybe even introduce chapter 2 today. Um, Before we get too far along, we are planning at least one more study tomorrow, same time. Terry's going to raise his hand constantly through the conversation, I think. Um, but so right now, Terry, let's go ahead and, if you would, could you read verses 19 through the end of chapter 1 for us, 19 through 26?
Absolutely. James 1:19. For those who don't know, I use the English Standard. So, know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. But the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your soul. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror, where he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious, and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world.
So, um, if you can't catch the quick and I think important connections to chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, let's go ahead and just kind of knock those out of the park. Contextually, we've got the Christians scattered abroad. Textually, there is the conflict between the impact of the devil and Jehovah, his good blessings, the strain that's brought upon us spiritually or ethically or otherwise through the text of James, say, verses kind of right around the verses 9 through 15 or so, when there's that conflict and switch from one side to the other. And then beyond that, now it's trying to make the next step of application, at least as I see it. So let's go ahead and break it into at least three chunks for today. The three first blocks, verses 19 through verse 21. And I think part of the section is kind of like it's an extension of verse 16, where it's a time to no longer see the world through misconception or hypocrisy, but really see the physical, the spiritual world, all of them exactly as they are, and stop fooling around. So verses 19 through 21, um, it includes one of the most quoted sections of the text of James as a response mechanism, verse 19. Um, and You can easily kind of see how the Christians in Jerusalem and the Jewish brethren there that were being spread would have that kind of response, to respond from anger and a man-made perspective when everything that they knew probably over the last 10 years had completely been destroyed. Their understanding of their faith and the trust in God had been shifted. Their physical circumstances are about to be shifted. And now God is asking them to go even more than that. Um, Great parallels to our current circumstance. But Terry, what do you see there that's important for us today in verses 19 through 21?
One thing that sticks out to me is this idea here of verse 20 that's tied in verse 19, that be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And then 21, put away filthiness, rampant wickedness, receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And so the core of all of that is developing in yourself the righteousness of God that saves your soul. I mean, I think that's one of the things. Those seem to be parallel kind of clauses with these kind of instructions on how to secure that. And so, I think sometimes we quote verse 19 and we forget that what it's setting up in verse 20 is this is how you become righteous, is with that behavior. I don't know about you, but every time I violated verse 19, it always results in me failing to have the righteousness of God, without exception.
Yeah.
And that's really what I think sticks out to me in that just 3-verse chunk is this idea of righteousness, that the disciple who speaks less, hears more, and doesn't get angry is righteous. And the disciple who puts away immorality and filthiness and instead focuses on the Word of God is righteous. And that seems to be the focus and what we should really focus on there in that text together, to me.
Yeah, I think there's a quick connection to James 3 on the impact of the capacity to control your speech, control your response. But one of the things that I think is challenging for all of us, and I think Terry kind of keyed into, is learning to respond with listening rather than talking or telling. If we can do that, then that's going to help us accomplish this bigger goal that will show up at the last part of this textual chunk, which is to receive the word, the engrafted word, the implanted word. I'll say also, if you're looking for textual connections and you want to make a note of a passage to read again, is to read the parable of the sower. This text is kind of a great hand-in-hand passage to Matthew 13 and to see how the word makes its space in the heart of a person. Because right in that context of the parable of the sower, we see some different hearts and how they respond. And so you can say, well, what's the good soil of the parable of the soil? Well, the good soil there, and the parable of the sower, that is really the one that doesn't respond with anger, but rather responds in a way that's quick to hear, slow to speak. And so it's going to give it a listen, a fair shake, if you will.
Yeah, and that good soil produces righteousness.
Yeah.
And not only in the story of the sower, not only righteousness in oneself, but then that bears fruit, which then helps produce righteousness in others. I think all of that needs to be pointed out as well.
As a side note, I know some folks over the time have asked us if this stuff would be available in other mediums. As of today, we'll see how it goes. This should be live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and probably will be live going forward on a few more platforms, the same conversations, and we'll try to do our best to kind of manage question and comments from all those mediums. And they'll live there after we're done too. They'll stay in the recorded videos. So it kind of moves from this sense of where your heart is, where your mindset is, to what you see in the text, to the next step level, which is verse 22, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. And that's verse 22 of the text. I would say that there's at least a couple of things that are important in that process of becoming a recipient who does versus a listener who doesn't. There's a level of self-participation and self-denial that's going to come in there because we're about to get to one of my personal favorite sections of James, verse 25, the law of liberty or the law that liberates. It's just a real simple shift, but you can't make the shift until you move one step further, and that one step further is really kind of saying, okay, I've heard it. Now what do I do? Acts chapter 2 is a great tie in as well. The audience, the crowd there, they're listening to the preaching of Peter and the others is, men and brethren, what shall we do? So Terry, at least from your perspective, and I'll probably add a few more things, what are some instructions, indications in the scriptures, experiences, advice you have if someone says, look, I've heard, now what do I want to do? What do I do? How do I do that better?
Yeah, so I think, so I would start off with what Jesus advised about the law would be love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And while that seems elementary, I think that covers so much, and especially that loving your neighbor like yourself. You tie in places like Philippians 2. Don't look out for only your own interests, but also the interests of others, and put others more highly than yourself, and uses Jesus as an example. I think so much of the action part of this is how we treat other people. And I think one of the very first things you have to do is to get outside of yourself and start serving other people. And by the way, I don't mean that in solely a social kind of interaction way, although I think that is in there. But I mean, the greatest way we take care of other people is by sharing the gospel with them. And there's no greater way to love your neighbor as yourself than to try to share redemption with them and what you know about redemption.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the biggest things about becoming a doer of the word. So many things throughout Scripture really focus on the interaction that we have with each other in our relationships. If you look in the Old Testament, every time that they had sinned and had been separated from God, one of the things that is often seen through there in prophets like Amos and others that they had not taken care of each other. They had really taken advantage of each other. They had used, specifically in Amos, they had used the poor for financial gain rather than providing for them. So, and even Matthew 25 in that judgment throne scene, when Jesus tells the story of separating the sheep from the goats, it's really about relationships and about how you treated other people, loving your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the greatest, probably, and by the way, I think also one of the more difficult things to do. It's really hard to do that. When you're at Walmart, and Walmart's a bad example because they don't really have 15 items or less lines anymore that have self-checkout, but maybe at a grocery store it doesn't have the self-checkout, and there's a 10 items less or 15 items or less or whatever, and you have right at 15 items, there's somebody behind you with one item. Rarely do you see somebody let that person go ahead because I got there first, I'm within the required limit, it's my right, I don't need to put them first. Or when you're getting on the interstate, you don't slow down and let somebody on, you speed up and get past them. I mean, all of those things, and as seemingly small and trivial as they are, what they really show us is that at the end of the day, we're really about winning for ourselves and not winning for others.
Yeah.
And so I think when I think about being a doer of the word and not just hearers, I think one of the greatest indicators of that is how you treat other people. And that really is a great litmus test.
Yeah, I think especially as the text shifts to each step forward, because the admonition is be a doer, not a hearer. But on the practical side, when you get to verse 24, for he looks at himself, even verse 23, for if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in the mirror, for he looks at himself and goes away and once forgets what he was like. The first layer of the image that James uses is pretty obvious. You look at yourself, say, this is what I look like. And you can think about it this way. Some friends and I joke about how on the inside, our minds kind of feel like we're still in our 20s and our bodies are not. We're in our mid to late 40s. And so there's usually a disconnect between I think I can do it and I really shouldn't do it. Spiritually, I think that's the same thing. We look at ourselves in the mirror and let's turn the picture just a little bit. We see our flaws, we see our weaknesses, we see our strengths, we see what's going on in our lives spiritually, our wisdom, our lack of wisdom, all of that. we step away from the mirror and we forget the inequalities with the reality of who we are and how we want to present ourselves. And a good way to think about this is just, okay, you see yourself that way, you put on your go to work clothes, your go to meeting clothes, or whatever, and you get to services, and you do not behave the way that you behaved when you were looking at yourself for real
Yeah.
in the mirror. You put on a fake outside, and we turn the tables off of Terry's illustration. You see that person come up, they've got one item, got 15 items. You let them go because you want them to see that you're the good guy, rather than acknowledging who you are and let them go because it's innately the kind of person you want to be. Knowing your weaknesses, and you're seeing them as, I want to treat them in a more holistic biblical way. I think there's a lot there. Hal's right to bring in the concert of humility into the process. And we can talk about it this way. We've talked about it before, probably about 7 or 8 months ago. We talked about criticism to the preacher and how a preacher responds to criticism. It takes a definite choice of maturity to accept that criticism and value it, and to see it as needful and necessary. And so I think Hal's definitely right. The humility is a component. Verse 25 is kind of where we're at, unless, Terry, you had something else you needed to slide in there.
I thought Hal's question there was interesting. Is there a shortcut or easy self-test for humility? And the answer is really no.
Yeah.
At
least not for me. I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, there's. Well, I can say undoubtedly there's no shortcut. If there was, we'd probably all be a lot more humble. The fact is, that's a really difficult thing to do, and it's interesting because the illustration of the mirror is interesting. It makes sense, but at the same time, you and I, as poorly as we look, we did not wake up looking this well this morning, and we looked in the mirror and said, "Oh no, we need to do something about that," and we did. But when it comes to the Word, we look into the Word, we see what we're supposed to be like, and we may do something about that, but only briefly, and then we walk away. And I think one of the problems with that is we compartmentalize. I think especially, I'm going to be somewhat gender specific. I think guys really compartmentalize everything more than females do. And one of the problems with that is, like, if we're not careful, we have the church version of Terry, and then we have the community version of Terry, and the work version of Terry, and the home version of Terry, and none of them add up to be the same. And I think that's a form of this forgetting who you are in those other environments and reverting to something else. And I think that's kind of part of this idea as well. But that's all contrasted with verse 25, and to the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, or as you said earlier, the law that liberates us and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. And Phil, what really stands out there is, and this goes back to, I think it ties back to the implanted word back in verse 21, and raises the bar a little bit, that this idea that the word has to be implanted in your life, but then in addition to the word being implanted, there's this idea that you have an obligation to remember that and to keep that at the forefront of your mind and to act upon it. And I think some people don't realize that that's what it means to have the word actually implanted in your life, is to know it, to remember it, to use it, to act upon it. That's what the implantation of the word really means for us today. And it's just, as we said, this keeps building and building each of these sections in that sense.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's a couple of steps that we can think about. But if we look at this verse, the law that liberates, and think about the different spiritual interactions that Jesus had with disciples on that first level. Many well-intended hearts came to him with that basic question, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And his answers were unique to the individual.
Yeah.
You would be blessed if you did this. You would be blessed if you kept this. You would be blessed, in essence, these are the short forms, if you gave this up. All of them are basic reflections of these are things that if you hold on to, they're going to, in essence, break the bond that you're looking to build with God. Um, and they're kind of all those unique, specific illustrations, but they're all things like if you do what I ask, if you do what God asks, if you follow what He asks, you will be set free. And that's
Yeah.
a
Well, and one of I think the most well-known examples of that is the rich young ruler, and
mhm.
of course his instructions was to sell all that he had and give to the poor. And there's been some people recently who I think have misapplied that and really tried to make that passage about caring for the poor, and that's Jesus' mission. And that's not the point of that story. That story is what's showing is for the rich young ruler, the thing that he kept forgetting and that was in the way of him growing in this relationship with God and growing in this idea of maturing in his faith was that his possessions were more important than that relationship with God.
Yeah.
And that's proven by the fact that he wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't willing to give all that up because he had a great many possessions. And as you said, there's other cases where he doesn't give those same instructions. Those instructions are tailor made. And we see that as Jesus telling this guy to sacrifice his stuff. But if you plug that into verse 25, what Jesus is trying to do is liberate him from what is really binding him and restricting him from who he needs to be.
Yeah.
And that's what his material possessions, because that's what had, in a sense, put him into bondage, was his material things.
So verse 26 through 28, the end of the chapter, two more really well read sections of James chapter 1. So we'll just break it into two parts because it's probably easiest. So verse 26 is a double down in two ways from James 3, but also the earlier context of James chapter 1. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart, but deceives his heart. This person's religion is worthless. Um, I want to throw off the first layer of that and say, while it is very and deeply important to consider um, profanity and all of those aspects of coarse jesting in regards to how we speak to not only the world but to one another, that's not exactly what James is getting at here. That's a side issue. Because in the context here, there is the broader perspective of what's going on with the Christians in Jerusalem, how they respond to the news, and the motivation to speak. And I say that because it is entirely possible to never use any curse word and yet have speech that is unsavory, unsound, unsalted, if you will, and destructive and divisive. And so the language choice issue is a side issue that is important, but it's not the issue. So slide that off the table for the time being. We could probably talk about that in a few months as a separate subject if we ever wanted to. But for right now, think about how your speech deceives your heart. And we're going to at least branch that into two things. In context, think of the ones who have the kind of speech that says they're religious, but the kind of life that says that they're not. And I think that's a powerful first step. And then the corollary is true. The kind of speech that doesn't look religious, they don't have all the right religious-y sounding words, but they have a life that looks deeply devoted to God. Both of those two polar possibilities exist on the table. And God says one of them is worthless, if you will, if you think about it.
Yeah, and I think the we talked about the speech, but the self deception that
Hmm.
this starts off with is also something to consider. Is, we need to be very careful that we don't deceive ourselves into thinking we're something we're not. Which goes back to Hal's comment about humility earlier as well,
Yeah.
and how layered this is, and how deceptive that is. Um, it's interesting that self-deception is tied to this issue of the tongue, which then results in you deceiving yourself and believing that you're something that you're not, which produces a vain, empty, worthless form of religion
Yeah.
in that sense. I can't help but think, and we tie this back to Jesus. I can't help but think about in this idea the Pharisees in verse 26. I don't know if you thought about that, but how they certainly had deceived themselves into their religion, but also what was also a big part of that was them not controlling their speech and their tongue in so many ways. And that wasn't done, as you said, through foul language or something like that. It was not controlling their tongue in how they spoke about themselves, how they spoke about others, and how they described themselves and the way they described their religion. And so even that seems that there's an interesting plug-in to kind of see a parallel there with that group in Jesus' time.
Absolutely. I want to kind of make a last powerful, at least to me, connection that I was studying about this morning as I was kind of getting ready for this. And so in James 1:27, it reads, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." In 1918, the Spanish flu went through the United States. And as a general rule, once the public request went out that, and here's the Tennessee Health Department said that in 1918, they requested that all churches close their meetings for October 20th and the 27th. No one protested. All 92 churches of Christ in the core Tennessee area there in Nashville did not meet those 2 Sundays. But here's something that is a tie-in that's in the same historical time frame. Ben West of Enos, Texas, wrote to the Gospel Advocate and said that Sunday was the first day for 12 years that I have failed to attend service. And then added, "We had 3 funerals here on Sunday. Though the church was not assembling, they were busy attending the sick." Um,
Yeah,
uh, this is from an
I saw that article as
article
well.
in the Christian Chronicle. If folks want citations for it, I'll probably just go ahead and drop it into the main Facebook comments because I was going to share it later today. Um, so I think it's really important for us to take that admonition of James to heart. And while we navigate our individual, what do we do today choices, one of the things we can do today is answer as Christians, how do we respond to that call? How do we, as individual believers who are following the Son of God, hear James remind us, which is an echo of the testimony of Paul? He was very eager to help the poor. That was one of the things he said to the brethren in Galatia. It's one of the things that Jesus certainly had as a component of his message. It's one of the things that the New Testament book of Acts shows us. How are we as individuals today and tomorrow and the next days going to look to those who have no parents, and those orphans as a general class, no parents in their lives, no leadership in their lives, and widows, those who don't have someone to care for them. I think that's one of those admonitions that is when the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, let me also say that I think it's interesting. 26 and 27 together reminded me of 2 Thessalonians 3, and from this standpoint, that there's this comparison about you think you're religious, but you don't control your tongue, and then verse 27 talks about here's what being religious looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and there's work prescribed for that, and the reason why I say that's similar is that in 2 Thessalonians 3, right after that, if you're not willing to work, don't eat, passage in verse 10. Verse 11 talks about there are some that are walking idleness, not busy, but busy bodies.
Yeah.
And the commandment for them is to work quietly and earn their living. Well, while that's not a direct parallel, obviously, because one is talking about working to earn a living in that context, here it's interesting, I think, that you have this picture painted of somebody who thinks they're religious, but their tongue is uncontrolled and their religion's worthless. And so, much like in the area of physical work, there's people that are running their mouth and not working. They need to go work. It's interesting that James kind of follows that same pattern. You think you're religious, you're not. You're not controlling your tongue, and what you need to do is you need to go work spiritually. You need to actually go and do these things that are good, righteous, religious things to do in that kind of context, and be busy. And in both cases, it's interesting that that idea of the idle hands as the devil's workshop kind of theme comes up here. And in this one, it is, instead of talking about being religious and deceiving yourself, actually go out and practice loving your neighbor as yourself and taking care of those who are in need, and specifically here, the orphans and the widows. And that action of working and doing keeps yourself unstained from the world. And it provides that protection in that sense, because you are busy doing good things rather than the idleness allowing you opportunity to do things that are not good.
Yeah.
And that just sticks out there in that parallel too from 2 Thessalonians 3.
Absolutely. And so I think when you get the capstone of the introduction of James, all the text, James 1, 1 through verse 27, 28, you're seeing James lay out the plan of attack, if you will, for the Christians who have now been pushed out of Jerusalem, pushed out of their homes. How are we going to be disciples in the present distress for them? Just like Paul will write of the present distress for Christians in those letters. So I think there's some definite spiritual value for us to really connect with and really connect to in the text. Terry, do you have any last things for today before we close out our study?
Well, I just want to end on the last note that I was talking about, that with what we're going through, some people aren't able to go to work, or maybe they're home with their kids, or maybe they're home from school. The temptation is there to have a lot of time on your hands and to not be as active and as working as you typically are. And if you're not careful, and especially since we're restricted on what we're supposed to do, that idleness can open yourself up to a lot of temptation, a lot of things you shouldn't do, and it can weaken you spiritually. So go seek out a way to serve other people today. That could be through a phone call or a card or an email, but look for some way to visit somebody without visiting them in the flesh, to respect that. But be active in working and serving other people, and don't give in to that idleness that we're all going to be tempted with in the coming days.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, everybody. I hope everyone has a good plan for today of things to rejoice about and to engage in acknowledgement of God's good and perfect gift that He provides to us. We'll be back again, should the Lord will, tomorrow, 10 Central, 11 Eastern Time. Thanks, Terry.